another episode of the Inspire Wealth podcast. I am your host, Mallory Meehan, aka Prof, and I'm joined by my good friend, Ed LeClear. Ed, how are we doing today?
Good, Mallory. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate
No,
it.
thank you. I appreciate you being here. So, Ed, I know a lot about your background, but I want you to introduce yourselves, tell us a little bit about what you do, how you got to this path, and then we'll kind of dive into some questions.
Okay, well, thanks. So Ed LeClear, I'm the planning director in the Borough of State College. So I work with Mallory as a resident and a volunteer. I guess the focus of my job, we have a staff of about 8 here at the borough, and our responsibilities are everything from handling new development for permitting as it comes through, zoning enforcement, which is an incredibly sexy topic, and I'm sure we'll get into that later on. And then also things like affordable housing. We deal directly with federal housing dollars through HUD, that we have responsibilities both to get the money out and do the right thing with it, but also to ensure compliance. So, we also do a lot of redevelopment work. So we work with the private sector to try to do affordable housing, to try to do business incubators and business development. I guess probably the last thing is all of their duties as assigned. I think as planning departments are often someone has an issue they want to tackle, and we're often the first line of engagement on that, to try to dig into it and figure out how we can help our residents.
I love that. So, Ed, how did you decide that this was a career path you wanted to take?
I know it's crazy, right?
I'm
Uh,
just curious. I'm genuinely curious.
yeah, well, it's funny you ask. So I'm a Cleveland kid. I'm from Northeastern Ohio originally, and growing up, I actually, when people talk about being inspired by teachers, actually in 5th grade, I had a teacher who we had civics that year in Ohio for school, and I had a teacher who was really into community involvement, and I had a lot of questions about where I lived. And I used to walk to school, and I walked by a really large grain feed mill. One of those old school. You walk in, it smells like birdseed,
Yeah.
they had to tear it down. Was in 5th grade because they widened the road, and I never understood what that was or why. And it kind of got me inquiring about choices that are made in a community, why things get torn down, why things get built. And then ended up doing a lot of political work when I was young, worked on a couple Senate campaigns and congressional campaigns, and came to realize that the way to actually influence policy and to try to get change on the ground was maybe not to be a politician and necessarily not to spend all your time raising money, which unfortunately that's a lot of that profession these days.
Yep.
And instead to help those folks make good decisions. And so a lot of my career path, I did public administration in undergrad, have a master's in planning, and really found that the best way to do this is help use information and everything, all the different data sets that we've got, all the different ways of information. Some of that is just community driven info, to help decision makers make good decisions. That's what a community planner does at its heart. And that directly involves things like property, real estate, how people make decisions about where they want their community to grow, what they want to preserve. So I get to be in the heart of that, and help the folks who actually have the vote, hopefully make good decisions.
No, that's awesome. I think it's a very notable, admirable position to be in because I know that it's not always easy dealing with a varying of opinions and backgrounds. But let me ask you this, Ed. So I'm sure you probably get this question all the time. If I am an aspiring real estate investor, and let's just say, for example, I'm looking to invest in State College, what would be a piece of advice you would give me as a newbie that I should know before I go forward and make a purchase for a single family home, a multifamily home, what have you?
Yeah, and I'm going to make a joke about we're from the government and we're here to help. But at the end of the day, the first thing is really to talk with the entities whose job it is to have regulations and sort of set the rules related to the property. And I, it's not just one entity. It's not just the Borough of State College. There's other groups that you would want to talk to, like Center Region Code Administration, for instance. They handle the building code regulations. It's always good to go directly to the source as far as what are the rules, because The worst thing on our end is when we end up in a situation where we have to take some kind of an enforcement action on someone, and it all could have been headed off sometimes years ago with a phone call.
Mhm.
And so first thing I always suggest is, um, first of all, get representation. If you're getting into a market for the first time, getting a realtor or talking to those who know the market helps. But um, everybody has imperfect information or imperfect knowledge. So the best thing to do is usually give us a call, let us know what you're trying to do. And there's different sets of regulations depending on what it is that you want to do, whether it's just purchasing a property, how you're going to use it. Well, that's likely regulated by zoning. How you want to rehab it or rehabilitate it, that's likely going to be both zoning and building codes. But other things like expectations about paving on the property, well, that might also trigger stormwater review, because you want to make sure that you don't have runoff coming off the property. So another entity you need to talk to. So it's really our job to help you navigate that. And so that's what my first advice is usually just start with a phone call. And then we can often also let you know the other groups that you should give a phone call to, because we don't want to speak for them. That's dangerous, but we also can get you in touch with them.
Yeah. Now I know that State College is kind of an anomaly when it comes to our renters and, the population in general. But what kind of process do people need to know about if they are getting a property that wasn't a rental and now they're turning it into a rental? What are some of the things that they need to kind of like check off the list in order to ensure that that's going to, happen?
Yeah, there's probably three big things to think about. And the first is, how is the property used when you're buying it? As you go into that contract, start asking these questions about, okay, is it just let's use a single family home as an example. It has no rental permit. It's not been rented in the past. Okay, so the process for there is, well, you need to ensure that it meets code when you go to rent it. So the Center Region Code Administration handles that process. So you're applying for a rental permit, and that rental permit comes with a zoning check from our office. So we check to make sure, okay, if you're gonna rent it, you're renting to the appropriate amount of people. We have occupancy restrictions. Many college towns restrict not only what we call standard occupancy, which is in State College, that's no more than 3 unrelated individuals, or a family, and that can go up to first cousin, and 2 unrelated. We also regulate student occupancy, and that's probably one of the biggest areas in State College that we have enforcement issues with. It's a college town. There's always been a recognition that we want to maintain a balance between student population and long-term residents. We're so small and we're so close to the university that it became evident really in the 1990s. And that was kind of the beginning of parents buying homes for their students and hanging on to those as investments after their students graduated. So there was really a push to kind of understand we're still going to have students in the neighborhoods, but if we don't do something, we'll eventually see all of our housing stock become student rental housing. So we do have zoning regulations related to that, and I can go in more detail if people want to be completely bored by it. But at the end of the day, that's a big issue, is trying to find that balance and administer that regulation. But then as you're going to get the rental permit, Center Region Code will inspect. And there are unusual things that I think when people, especially if you have a historic home, an older home, that you may be surprised about. For instance, I have a 1956 ranch. I probably won't get a rental permit because of some of the things that I know that I would need to do. My fireplace, for instance, is way too wide. The 50s had a, really nice big wide fireplace was in vogue. Well, I can't get close to code without just shutting the whole thing down. And I like my fireplace.
Mhm.
But there's things like that, sealing the floor height, the headspace on a door above the door. These are things that you need to make sure are safe, and it does cause investors to have to, put money into the property to get it up to code. So
Yeah.
always recommend folks talk with Center Region, and kind of go through that process. But those are the big first steps.
Mhm.
And then from there, it becomes a matter of understanding the difference between like a single family home and a multifamily. There's different occupancy regulations that go with that. And we often end up with somebody thinking, oh, well, I bought a duplex and I want to carve that up into some additional apartments. Well, there's regulations on that. And obviously, if their pro forma has got more units in there than they're going to be able to get to, then the numbers are off. So we try to keep that from happening right off the bat.
Yeah, no, that's definitely something important to know. So when you talk about zoning, now let's assume I look at a zoning map and I find an opportunity, but that opportunity isn't going to fit within the zoning. And we know that we have, prescribed uses that you can use the property under different zoning codes, but then we also have accessory unit uses. Now, explain to me how I have to go through the process of maybe one of the accessories or something that maybe isn't on the list to try to get that as an approved zoning use.
Yeah, let's do a little bit of definition first, just to get your listeners to kind of understand the nuances there. So in pretty much all zoning ordinances, you're going to have a list of uses that we consider by right. This is, for instance, in our R2 district, a single family home is by right. You can use it, and all that really is the zoning officer in our office checks a box saying, yes, we checked it, it's permitted, you can go forward. When you start looking at uses that aren't defined as by right, you could have some uses that are what we consider a conditional use. That requires, it's still permitted, but it requires a hearing before the governing body, in our case, Borough Council, and they can attach conditions. There's also uses that will be called special exceptions. Similar idea, but you're going to go through a zoning hearing board, which is a quasi judicial body. It's not elected, it's appointed. They act as judges essentially, and they can do the same thing. They can permit it, but add conditions related to health and safety and welfare. Then you've got a situation like you asked where maybe something is accessory. For instance, home-based businesses, if it's got no impact, so you're not getting deliveries. This was really done in sort of the growth of the Amazon, Etsy, everybody that's doing something in their house and then they're shipping it out. Um, that would potentially require a permit from us, but it's going to be permitted because in the state of Pennsylvania, the Commonwealth wanted to make sure that those kinds of businesses were permitted. But when you start to get outside of no impact and you do start to have an impact as a home-based business, then it's likely to be something that's either not permitted or has some pretty significant conditions that are written into the ordinance about that use. Now, when you get to something that isn't permitted, isn't identified as a permitted use in the district, if you're wanting to add that, that's a legislative process. That's a going through with Borough Council in our case, asking for what we call a zoning text amendment. So you're changing the text. You could also approach it like what we call a map amendment. Let's say that we had this recently where Out of the Cold now has a homeless shelter. The property they were looking at, they identified as an opportunity to acquire. It was on the line between two different zones. And what they wanted to do was permitted immediately adjacent to them, but not on this property that they had identified. So we went through the legislative process and council amended the map and just grabbed that parcel, pulled it into the district where it was permitted. So that's another technique. We work with folks all the time who look at the regulations and say, man, I have this great idea. I really want to do this. Why is this not permitted? And we either help them try to find other locations in the borough where it is permitted in a zone. And on a rare occasion, occasionally we'll work with them and council to see if council is interested in changing the zoning. And it's an occupational hazard to try to crystal ball elected officials, but we do work to try to give a recommendation and hope to see that if that gets changed or not. We had a woman who wanted to open a cat cafe right before COVID. She had some bad luck related to the pandemic, never ended up happening, but we went through about a 5-month process with council to get that permitted and they did adopt it. So if anybody's interested in opening a cat cafe in the west end of State College, that is permitted by zoning, but you can't have more than 10 cats. That was written into the ordinance.
Got it. Noted. So, listeners out there, reach out to Ed if you are
But
interested in a cat cafe in the west end of State College.
there you go.
Oh, that's funny. So Ed, one of the things that I'm looking at is the vacancy specifically for retail and office, and this is a national issue across the US that we are seeing obviously office space not being utilized with the work from home hybrids and companies kind of reorganizing. And then right now, especially in State College, we saw a a growth span of student high rises, and part of the code when they were given this was that the lower two levels needed to be open for commercial use, lower level being retail, upper level being office. Now, tell me what the local government is trying to do to kind of help with the the landscape of State College to fill some of these vacancies. What are some of the initiatives that you are seeing currently, and what's working and what isn't working, and where are you going from here?
Yeah, I think we're in early days as far as kind of public intervention to try to help the market fill those spaces. Maybe to step back a little bit on the policy background, State College lost a lot of business in the 80s and 90s as it migrated out, as a lot of core communities did all over the country, where cheaper parking, more available parking, lower rents, newer space. So we have the growth in North Atherton, we have the growth in College Township, and Ferguson Township as well. And so there was a policy decision by council in the 2000s to say, we want to create new modern space in downtown to try to get some of those businesses to come back. And we did build another parking garage in that process as well to try to open up some additional spaces. So that policy goal was one of the reasons that the zoning requires, as you said, sort of the 2 floors of commercial. And the other idea was that we wanted firms to locate in downtown using like a KCF, for example. We wanted to grow that local business model to say, we want you to actually have your employees based and hopefully living in State College and being able to walk to work and sort of use that competitive advantage that we have with the university here, with our really walkable neighborhoods. And so that was another policy objective. So zoning was one of the ways to try to tackle that. At the same time, the massive wave of equity that was looking to invest in student housing, that kind of dovetailed. It all kind of happened, as you said, very quickly. We saw a dramatic change. And when I work with my peers in other Big Ten towns, we're all dealing with the same thing. This has happened in Ann Arbor and Bloomington and everywhere. So that was a market response to equity looking for a reasonable rate of return, and the purpose-built student housing world became very attractive, especially after the mortgage world crashed. So I think that the policy objective of getting firms to locate and getting more retail space in town, coupled with all of that massive building that occurred, it left a lagging amount of vacancy. And I say lagging because we are seeing movement toward filling them. But I think the challenge is that the rent structures are so high. And again, looking for things like 10-year leases, that a small local company that's just starting out, especially retail, they're not suited for that kind of rent. They're not suited maybe for that term. And so you're really ending up with Buffalo Wild Wings, which just announced a few weeks ago coming into the max. And so I think what we're struggling with on the borough side is what can we do to either master lease or provide funds to try to fit out the spaces, because a lot of this is gray shell. And we know that there's a big investment needed to get from the current state into something that a business can fit out and open. So we're looking at subsidies. We're also looking potentially becoming an entity that could do some master leasing where you could subsidize the rent, but then that also means that government is taking the haircut, and are our taxpayers willing to do that? So building that political will to say, yes, it's worth us, and trying to create space for an incubator. Like we've been looking at restaurant incubators, knowing that if you invest in commercial kitchens, now you could have restaurateurs come in. They don't need to fit out the kitchen. They're on a short-term lease, try to create that space. But again, we have to build political will to make that investment. And I think at a staff level, we're still working on that to make sure that if there is a program, it'll work and help. And that our elected officials feel they can support it, and that our residents, when we get around to budget time, feel like the money is well spent.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of things happening at the same time where you need to find a equilibrium between business owners, between residents, between the political spectrum. And so that's definitely challenging. And so I'm curious, Ed, on your day-to-day kind of task list, what are some things that you find really enjoyable on what you're doing? And we'll talk about maybe some of the challenges or maybe ways that you overcome some of those hurdles that you have to meet.
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge, we are the Borough of State College is a pretty high performing local government. I've been in Pennsylvania about 25 years and I worked around the state. And one of the aspects of being high performing is that we are very reactive. We hear complaints. We have a really active citizenship that is, really focused on maintaining quality of life, and also trying to meet other objectives, whatever that individual resident's desire is, or what they want to see changed. So we spend a lot of our time trying to be responsive to our residents, which is a good thing. But at the same time, it often crowds out maybe the larger, more complicated projects that, when you ask about things that I get personal and professional enjoyment out of, the trying to solve wicked problems. I mean, trying to say, okay, well, what is it going to take to create a retail environment in downtown State College that is something that is long-term growth, that we know is producers, is the kind of economics that isn't just vape shops and restaurants. Not that restaurants aren't important, but like trying to future-proof us to some degree and think about what are the kinds of business we want to encourage. Also recognizing that the university is spinning off a lot of intellectual property. There is a lot of amazing development happening, or ideas that are coming out of the university. We don't want to lose that. Let's grab that. And what are we going to do to keep some of that business development here and grow companies that are here, like KCF, for instance? So that's enjoyable to me, but those are tricky. And like you said, they're often, you have to tackle it from multiple perspectives, and that takes time, money, staff. And so trying to create those resources when you also have folks calling about, you know, uh, someone just put a chicken coop in yesterday, next door, and now I've got 4 chickens that are in my property that have run loose. I mean, that uh, chicken coops are kind of the bane of our existence a little bit. As far as that was like my second week on the job, we were actually trying to catch chickens.
Oh my God.
So it's those trying to balance all those different needs, and I'm sure anybody who's in government will tell you there's never enough resources to
Mhm.
do all the things that our community would like us to be doing. So trying to prioritize and recognizing that we can't always move the needle nearly as fast as enough as we want to, doesn't mean it's not worth trying to move it. And just being persistent and having stamina, and knowing that sometimes the work you do now may not bear fruit for 5, 6, 7, 8 years. That's okay. That's part of the mission. You still got to do it. And then be really happy when it bears fruit 7 years later.
Yeah. So, as a local government, are there incentives or programs that maybe potential investors could look into, or those that maybe are thinking of starting a business that would allow them easier access to get into a place like State College?
I think the first thing, and you kind of mentioned the uh, interaction between businesses and the space they're going to go in, and or how are they actually going to operate. Um, First thing I always suggest is working with small business development at Penn State, using SBDC to talk about business planning, make sure that you are developing a business that can be financed and will be, somewhat economically stable. Yeah, I know people are taking risks. It's not, if we all knew that our idea was going to be amazing, then we'd all be entrepreneurs, right? So but I think that we often run into landlords who are saying, well, listen, I am willing to rent my space. I'm even willing to rent it at a lower level, or maybe do some creativity with the terms, or when we're going to balloon it, et cetera. But I'm just not getting businesses that seem to have a viable business plan. So I think the first thing is just really working with SBDC and some other entities to help make sure you really have a good business plan as a first step. Second is, there are some funds through EDA, Economic Development Administration, and we're always looking at the borough to look at state funds to see how we can bring some of that to bear. So we're actually doing some applications now, to work with the Downtown State College Improvement District to look at facade improvements, or to try to look at, again, how we could do some help with fitting out some of those tenant spaces. But I think the biggest challenge is those pots of money are small, and especially right now we're looking at about 85,000 square feet of vacant commercial space in State College. Um, doing some quick math, if you were to multiply that by, say, $170 a square foot, just to get it ready to get to warm vanilla, like that's a lot of money. And so being able to have, I think we'd run numbers was like 20 to 30 million for what we would do to really fit out everything. There isn't a funding source I'm aware of that will come close to that. So
Yeah. Outside of maybe some generous donations from people who are just
if you have some alumni that, yeah, you can speak with, but we are always trying to find ways to help. And the other issue I think on our end is, are you investing in the property? Are you investing with the landlord, or are you investing with the business? And a challenge that I think the public sector often has is you want some permanence there on that investment. So there's usually less of a risk to work with the landlord because they own it, and you'll see that investment there long term. Versus if you're investing in say loans for working capital or trying to help the business, that's obviously a lot riskier. And we do have a responsibility to make sure if we're investing that we turn around your elected officials say, why did you just flush that money down the toilet? So that's a challenge that we often have, is trying to make sure that we've got something to show for those loans. We did do some small business loans during COVID, and they have performed. We've only had one default at this point, and we did about 15 or 16. So that's a good track record at this point.
Yeah, no, that's great. Now, I guess let's kind of wrap everything up and tell our listeners what you think is, important steps to follow when they're starting to evaluate an investment, like people they need to contact to. And then generally like your best piece of advice for working with different local municipality leaders and how they can work to actually getting something from idea to completion.
Well, I think the first thing to recognize is that elected officials all bring their own perspectives and backgrounds and knowledge to the table. And one of the things we try to do at a staff level is bring folks to council or to the governing body to give them background and give them an understanding of what the challenges and potential ways to help are. So I think one of the things to think about is, if you're trying to be an investor or you're looking for how you can fit a business idea into a space, recognizing that most government entities, whether the staff level or our elected officials, they want to help. They generally want to see improvement in their community. Nobody I know in this building is happy with 85,000 square feet of vacant space downtown, right? So being able to know that we want to be a partner. On the other side, there are things that we have legal responsibilities for, like on zoning enforcement. I can't tell you how many times folks have asked, well, I have a great idea, and it's a great idea. You acknowledge it's a great idea. Can't you just let me do it? And we have rules and regulations that our job is to enforce. I don't love to say no, but when someone says, well, can't we just put up a shipping container bar in downtown State College? You got to make sure that shipping container bar is safe and that people have means of egress. You also need to make sure that it's going to meet things like setbacks and other requirements in the zoning. And those are there, again, to protect health, safety, welfare. So recognizing that the government isn't saying no to your idea, it's saying we have other rules and regulations we need to make sure we're enforcing. And we always like to try to help folks figure out how to fit their idea into those rules, or in some cases going to the governing body and asking them to change those rules. But they always, again, have to balance out health, safety, welfare decisions, whenever they're deciding to change those rules. So just a couple things to think about. We want to be helpful. I guess another thing too is to recognize that our processes, and they always take longer than any of us would like, including on our end. So help us help you walk through those processes. And we do work here in the borough to try to make them transparent. We do a lot of work with, fact sheets and web-based, info that helps people understand, okay, I need to do X, Y, Z, trying to make that transparent. And we can always do a better job with that. But I think that's something that, if your listeners know, work with us and recognize that we're here to try to walk you through the things you need. And sometimes you're going to have a great idea that just isn't going to fit. And so we'll try to work with you to find, are there other places in the municipality where that can fit. So,
Great. Love it. And thank you for sharing some of your wisdom and some of your knowledge. And I appreciate you and your service and your work and helping make at least State College a better place to live, play. So thank you. For our
thanks, Mallory.
listeners, thank you for listening to this episode of Inspire Wealth. I'm Prof M, out.